Well, first, thank you all for having me today. I'm going to talk to you about racism, not race. I began to think about why and how people thought racially in our society in the early 1990s, which led to the publication of my first book on the topic, The Emperor's New Clothes, which is a history of racial thinking in the Western world up to the 21st century. That was shortly followed by the race myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, which examined the ongoing pathologies that occurred in American society in particular, but also globally, because of people continuing to think in racial terms. My newest book is with my colleague, Dr. Alan Goodman. This was published in December of 2021, although it's listed with a copyright date of 2022, called Racism, Not Race. And this book was written in a question answer format based upon responses that Alan and I had fielded over the course of our 30 plus years in higher education, from our students, from people in our community, from other scientists who don't understand race very well either. And so this is out now. In fact, a really nice review of it came out today in the journal Racial and Ethnic Studies. Now, this fall, I certainly hope to be with you in person to talk about my next book, which publishes on September 13th of 2022, Voice in the Wilderness, which explains how I think about nature and particularly evolution, and how that's a critical perspective in terms of dealing with some of our greatest issues. And this, again, is worldwide. Now, today's talk is also going to include some perspectives that I developed in two essays. One that was published in a book about the fictional television series Supernatural, which, by the way, I'm sure you all know, much of which is filmed in British Columbia. And the title of that essay is God is Good, Chuck Not So Much. And also a chapter in a book on critical approaches to science and religion, which comes out this year as well, called Out of Africa, Where Faith, Race, and Science Collide. So you will often hear people in the humanities make this sort of bland statement: race is not a scientific concept. Now, the problem with this statement is it's confusing, and it fails because it conflates two very different concepts. The first is the biological race concept, and the second is socially constructed or socially defined race. And today I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving you a sense of the history of the biological race concept that most people don't appreciate. The first is that the biological race concept really sort of begins in modernity. And here I mean in conjunction with the European voyages of discovery of the 15th century, and starts out on two basic criteria, which is what individuals look like and where they're found. But what most people don't understand is that biology, prior to the middle of the 19th century, and really prior to the 20th century, was foundationally special creationist. In other words, in the Western world, biology was conducted by individuals who had no doubt that organisms were the result of a supernatural act of special creation. And I'll talk about that more in some detail. Now, after the publication of On the Origin of Species, and then going into the 20th century with the unification of Mendelian genetics with natural selection theory, what we call the neo-Darwinian synthesis, then our understanding of human biological variation is rooted in examination of the frequency of genetic variants within specific populations. And then later on in the 20th century, with the development of phylogenetic techniques, races are thought to result from them being unique evolutionary lineages. Now, these concepts are very different, and in terms of the way modern biology deals with human biological variation in general, including that of humans, it is only population and cladistic ideas that have any currency in the 21st century. The geographical location morphology ideas about human biological variation were debunked, in the 19th century. Now, but all of these things are different from socially defined or socially constructed race. This concept arbitrarily utilizes aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, or any other thing that one can throw into the mix, but it only does so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. So in other words, when Alan and I entitled our book, Racism, Not Race, we wanted to make the point that it was racism that created the socially defined cultural groups described as races, not the underlying biological variation within our species. So in other words, these races only ever had one purpose, which was the subordination of some and the uplifting of others. Now, to understand this, you need to recognize for the vast majority of human history, and I want to be clear so folks in the audience understand, that the human species is about 340,000 years old. Now, no one left Africa until around 100,000 years ago. And I'm going to go into greater detail. And when we start talking about recorded history, such as, the writings of the Hebrew Bible, you're talking about on the order of 5,500 years ago. So here, you need to understand the vast majority of human existence, human history, people never traveled more than 40 miles from their place of birth during their lifetime. So it wasn't an opportunity for people in any way to get a sense of the variation in physical traits that exist within humans upon our planet. So when the authors of the Old and New Testament wrote their material, okay, they had no idea about other people who didn't look like them. Now, we can then move forward to the European Age of Discovery, which is in the 15th century, but let's go back to the ancient world for a moment. So Egyptian hieroglyphics describe humans from southern Russia to the equator, but there is no mention or the concept of race in Egyptian society. To both the Greeks and the Hebrews of the 8th century before Common Era, such as the prophet Amos and the Greek historian Homer, Ethiopia and Scythia were considered the most remote places in the world. Now, Ethiopia should not be confused with the modern nation state, but rather is associated with the entire region south beyond the Blue Nile, called Cush in the ancient Hebrew. Scythia meant the regions to the farthest north. Herodotus, the Greek historian, did not mention the concept of race either, and Herodotus was writing around 484 to 425 BCE. Now, if one takes a look at the world of the Hebrew Bible, you're really talking about events that occur in the Fertile Crescent through the Levant to Lower and Upper Egypt. And that's pretty much all the people who are described in those texts. Now, this changes, of course, in the Roman Empire of the 1st century CE. Rome has conquered much of the Eastern Hemisphere, at least what they considered to be their world. Rome had trade relationships with countries or groups as far east as China, as evidence of persons of Chinese descent living within the Roman Empire. Now, this therefore gives people a much wider understanding of human biological variation based upon the extent of which now humans are coming into contact. I mean, in the 2nd century, for example, the Roman governor of Britannia, Septimus Severus, was an African. So people were now seeing that not everybody looked like them. But even here, you really never see the development of ideas of race as we understand them in the modern world. Now, prior to the European voyages of discovery, Marco Polo traveled from Venice across Central Asia to China and came back by way of Southern Asia. The Islamic scholar Ibn Battuta traveled from Morocco to the Balkans, the Black Sea, Southern Russia, China, India, Middle East, and so on. Neither of these people coined a race concept. So there's an important event that occurs in the 15th century, particularly the ability to travel the ocean by ship is an important technological innovation that allowed individuals to travel across oceans as opposed to land, and as a result, observe people from different portions of human biological diversity without going through the continuous change between these groups. And so for Columbus, sailing from Spain to the Caribbean, he doesn't see all of the continuous change in human physical traits. He ends up in the Caribbean and people are physically and culturally different from him and his sailors. Now, shortly after colonialism begins to take place in the Western Hemisphere, we begin to see new speculation about human biological variation, beginning with the ideas of Paracelsus in 1520, who coined the idea of the pre-Adamite races, that there had in fact been separate Adam and Eves, and that is what accounted for the physical variation that you saw in human groups. He thought that Africans and other dark-skinned people were the descendants of Cain. You know, where God put a mark upon Cain, that mark now became dark skin. And while Europeans were the descendants of Abel. In 1591, Giordano Bruno, an Italian philosopher who, by the way, is considered a great hero in the history of science, argued that no reasonable person could believe that Ethiopians had the same ancestries as the Jews, and therefore God must have created separate Adams. So once again, we have a pre-Adamite polygenous theory. Okay, now Bruno was burned at the stake for heresy by the Inquisition in 1600. Most people know about his heresy around the Copernican universe, that is, the sun being the center of the solar system and not the earth. But one of the other charges against Bruno was his adherence to the pre-Adamite race theory. Now, going into the 18th century, now with, far-flung oceanic voyages, Europeans coming in contact with many different groups of people that they'd really not seen before, you begin to have naturalists. And again, I want to emphasize that these naturalists were all Christians, beginning to think about how and why humans were different. So Barnier in 1684 looks at the traits of Africans and Europeans and says, well, they're really, not better than the other. He didn't really know whether these were heritable or environmentally induced. And he certainly felt that all humans were members of the same species. Similarly, Leibniz, Blumenbach, Camper, Buffon, Miners, all pretty much felt that all humans belong to the same species. But Blumenbach and others felt that these differences were in fact the result of inherent inborn characteristics. Now, since these folks are special creationists, these inborn differences had to be the result of something having to do with supernatural creation. Now, Blumenbach, for example, thought that different races of humans had degenerated at different rates since the fall of Adam, hence giving them different physical characteristics. Now, this changes dramatically in the 19th century. And in The Emperor's New Clothes, I explain how the ascendancy of both colonialism and chattel slavery were major impotence for the changing of the thinking of scientists about human biological variation. So one of the things you see right away in the 19th century is that all of these naturalists feel that Africans are inferior to Europeans. That was not generally true in the 18th century. Now, they looked at different traits. They also felt that this inferiority was heritable, that the environment played no role in the inferiority of the African. And all of these naturalists felt that Africans were, in fact, a separate species from Europeans. So let's be clear that we're not talking about varieties or biological races. We're talking about different species. And again, this was done based upon various characteristics. The leading theorist of polygeny in the 19th century was a Swiss-born naturalist, Louis Agassiz, who I'm going to talk some more about in a few slides. So in the 19th century, all of biology in the Western world was formulated on the principle of intelligent design. So everything about nature was a testimony to the greatness and beneficence of God. Now, this is outlined in William Paley's Natural Theology, which was published in 1802, the Bridgewater Treatises, which were published, a series of essays published between 1830 and 1840. And by this thinking, again, human biological variation also fell under that logic. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time about the writing and attitudes, particularly about chattel slave owners in the USA, but they definitely felt that divine providence had provided them superiority of intellect and physical character and morality compared to the darker races of the earth. And in fact, they were doing God's work by colonizing these people and enslaving them. So certainly amongst the Southern slaveholders, that was their view. And this was then buttressed by the writings of the naturalists that I showed you on the prior page. Now, by the middle of the 19th century, the main scientific question in biology, and again, biology is really in its most elementary state as we would understand it today. The main question was the origin and maintenance of species, and particularly variation. So it had already been shown, despite the protestations of various special creationists, that species had changed through time in the geological record. At first, creationists argued that these were geological imperfections in the rocks. They weren't actually the remains of prior life. That theory fell on its face so quickly, it's not even worth a lot of discussion. So then people like Agassiz came forward with an alternative theory, which was catastrophism. And that was the idea that God had created different forms of life for different periods in the Earth's history, and then, sent a great catastrophe. For Agassiz, originally these were ice ages, which wiped out those species, and then there was a subsequent creation. Those were wiped out, a subsequent creation, those were wiped out, and so on. The last of which being the Great Noachian Flood, which wiped out a whole bunch of humans, including many of the pre-Adamites, and also a lot of organisms. So in contrast to that was uniformitarian geology, of which Sir Charles Lyell, then the leading person in British science, was the chief advocate for. And uniformitarian geology said, no, everything that's happening in the formation of the earth is still happening today. The forces are the same. There haven't been a series of drastic catastrophes in the past, and that what we're looking at is continuous change, and that therefore there's been continuous change of life. Now, but in the middle of the century, Lyell agonized over the implications of his young protege, Charles Darwin's species theory, because he clearly understood the implications of common descent. Here he writes, quote, "Go back umpteen generation, and would blacks and whites find a common ancestor? Itself descended of an ape. The idea would give shock to nearly all men. No university would sanction it. It would ensure the expulsion of a professor already installed." So the notion that all human beings shared common descent, although a biblical notion originally with Adam and Eve, for scientists in the 19th century, this, of course, is now reason for a professor to be expelled from the university. Now, the race concept in mid-century and its social implications were at an explosive point. The Scottish physician Robert Knox had achieved new notoriety by prophesizing the coming race wars. Now, the question, of course, I proposed to Knox, if I could speak to him, is where was he at when Europeans had been conducting wars based upon race against Africans and American Indians for the last 4 centuries? But laying that aside, during this time period, Agassiz had come to change his view concerning species and human races, because originally he had also been a monogenist. And he then adopts the polygenist separate creation theory, and then develops a zoological theory in association with it called zones of creation. And in zones of creation, Agassiz felt that God had created different zones along the earth, each complete with its own flora, fauna, and humans. Now, in 1856, as Darwin prepared for the publication of The Origin, he wrote, "Agassiz will throw a boulder at me, and many others will pelt me," because he also understood that his idea of common descent also meant common descent of all living people. Now, to give you a quick contrast between Agassiz and Darwin, and let me point out why this is an important contrast to make. Agassiz was, internationally renowned as one of the greatest scientists of his time. So he stood at the pinnacle of the profession, whereas Darwin was a young upstart. So at this point, contrast is useful. So for Agassiz, his geology was catastrophist, Darwin's was uniformitarian. Agassiz was an anthropocentric thinker. He thought humans were the center of creation. Darwin thought that humans were one of many species. Okay, for Agassiz, species had distinct periods and zones. Darwin thinks that all species resulted from a process of descent with modification and therefore are all related. Agassiz's political values were conservative. Darwin's were progressive for his time period, particularly around issues of race. Agassiz had really only traveled Europe at this time. Later, he would travel South America. But Darwin had the opportunity to travel around the world as a naturalist on HMS Beagle. Agassiz's personality was gregarious and public. Darwin was introverted. Agassiz felt that the human races were separate species. Darwin thought that they were one species. Agassiz felt that there was a distinct racial hierarchy, and that is Europeans were supreme. Darwin thought that the emotion and intellect of humans were similar. Both of them were abolitionists, but they were abolitionists in different ways. Agassiz was a Jeffersonian Lincoln abolitionist, which meant free the Africans and send them back to Africa, whereas Darwin was generally for abolition. Now I'm going to jump you into the 20th century. The ideas of Charles Darwin with regard to descent with modification didn't take off immediately. It actually took a couple of decades before most biologists would have said that they adhered to the idea of natural selection. And one of the main requirements for that to happen was the unification of natural selection with Mendelian genetics. Now, this was called the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, and the focus of this intellectual program was the origin, significance, and maintenance of geographical variation, and that is in all species, not just humans. Now, one of the architects of that synthesis, Ernst Mayr, noted that the term subspecies, which is equivalent to what we understand as geographical race, had come into common usage in the 19th century, replacing the notion of the variety. And the variety is the way Linnaeus described differences within species. But this is what he says about this concept of geographical race. Quote, "The concept of subspecies is fallacious. The better the geographical variation of the species is known, the more difficult it becomes to delimit subspecies, and the more obvious it becomes that many such delimitations are quite arbitrary." Now, at the same time, one of the world's greatest population geneticists, Sewell Wright, had developed a set of statistics to look at genetic variation on different scales, that of the local population, that of the regional population, and that of the entire species. Now, his entire species level variation statistic is called FST, and it's given by the equation in the center of this slide. Now, I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible because I know most of the people in this audience are not geneticists. So what Wright proposed is that we could look at the level of genetic variation within each of the subpopulations in a species and compare it to the total variation of that species. Now, you might think of those subpopulations as being bounded by geographical regions, such as Africa, Middle East, Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, the Pacific Islands, North and South America. So all of the variation of the species versus the variation of a particular place. Now, if you look at the form of that equation, it basically takes on the value of 1 if there is no differences between the subpopulations. So if the subpopulation HS is 0, then HT over HT is 1. That says that the populations are so dramatically different from each other that you certainly have clear designation of subspecies or geographical races. Now, on the other hand, if HS and HT are equal to each other, meaning the genetic variability within the subpopulations is equivalent to that of the total species, then the numerator becomes 0. And that says that the population, the species is so connected that there's no genetic variation between any of its subregions. Now, Wright argued that at the level of 0.250, or about 1/4, any value above that is strong indication that you have geographical races existing along the range of the species. Values below that says, you're really just one species with sufficient gene flow between your regions, so you're not really differentiated. Now, what this gives us is a very different metric to look at genetic variation, because the physical traits of organisms come from their genetic basis, than just looking at things and saying, oh, well, you look different, so you got to be a different race. So when we measured this, and believe me, people wanted to measure this right away, we found that human populations don't exceed Wright's critical threshold. So let me give you on this slide an example of what this would look like in real world data. So on the left-hand side, you see 5 populations whose values for a specific gene are pretty much the same. If you calculate the FST value from the left-hand panel, it's something close to 0. And hence you would say, oh, there's no geographical races in that species. Now, on the right-hand side, here's an example of where these populations differ dramatically in the frequency of a specific gene. Here you would calculate an FST value that is greater than 0.250. Now, this is, of course, going to be dependent upon which gene you look at. So in the panel below, I give some real world data from the allele frequency database, in which you can see that, for example, the gene MC1R, which plays a role in producing fair skin. And I just want to point out to you that all humans started out with dark skin. But MC1R, right, is strongly differentiated between Eurasia and the tropics, meaning people in Africa tend to have a much higher frequency of the C nucleotide given in yellow. People in Europe tend to have a much higher frequency of the T nucleotide given in green. So that's just one particular genetic variant. And as you know, skin color differs between the tropics and the temperate zones. However, if we look across the entire genome, instead of just one place, as we do here in this data, I can show you on the left-hand side from coding regions within the human genome. And I'm going to quickly explain what I mean by coding and non-coding. You may not be aware that only about 1.5% of the DNA in your cells actually makes proteins that makes you, you. That means that 97% or more is DNA that really doesn't do much of anything for you. So when we look in those coding regions along chromosome 5, 9, 13, 17, 21, and we calculate the FST values, they don't get higher than 0.103. And here we're looking at thousands of genetic markers. On the right-hand side, we're looking at non-coding regions which don't make anything, and therefore mutations in those non-coding regions occur more frequently, and natural selection is not concerned with them because they don't do anything. And again, now we're looking at genetic markers in excess of 23,000 for each chromosome. The FST values go up slightly to 0.154, but this again never exceeds Wright's critical threshold value of 0.250, indicating that Africans and Europeans are not genetically different biological races. Now, we can also show across the globe, as this study did, Lawson Hanley et al. In 2007, that the difference in FST values between any two populations paired against each other is a direct function of their geographic distance between them. So in other words, populations that live closest to each other share more genetic variants in common than populations that live very distant from each other. But even if that is true, even at the greatest distances between populations, say Central Africa and Amerindians of Brazil, you still don't exceed Wright's value, 0.250. And furthermore, when you see that this is a direct function of geographical distance, genetic distance is continually changing. So in other words, we don't see clumped groups. We don't see a lot of space between groups, indicating that there's continuous change as opposed to discrete clusters. And for you to have biological races, you would need to see discrete clusters. We don't see that in human data. So, and when we look at using phylogenetic methods, the relationship between particular groups, we get stories very different from our social expectations. For example, pairwise FST between sub-Saharan African hunter-gatherers is greater than the distance between sub-Saharan farmers and Europeans. So East Africans and the Maasai people are more similar to Europeans than they are to the Khoisan, who are hunter-gatherers in Africa. The Sandawe, who are farmers, are closer to Europeans than they are to the Hadza, who are hunter-gatherers. So using social definitions of race, you would group Sandawe and Hadza together, but genetically, the Sandawe are closer to Sardinians. Once again, demonstrating that these social ideas don't match the genetic variation within our species. So at the end of the day, if I'm the first person to tell you this, we are all Africans. And what I mean by that is the amount of genetic variation that produces the physical traits that make you look different from Africans is minuscule. So quickly, because I know I'm running late on time. If you were going to look at the phases of the existence of our species, phase one, modern human origins, that all happened in Africa. Phase two, you begin to see population divergence between hunter-gatherers and farmers. And again, this is happening in Africa. Phase three, we see migration out of Africa. And now, at this point, if you look at the lineages that exist within the human species, I want you to note that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 are in Africa. 1, 2, 3, 4 are outside. And what this means is that the vast majority of genetic variability within our species at this current moment resides in Africa. So another way of saying that is if I were to choose the genome of 2 Africans at random and 1 African and 1 European at random, the African and European would be closer to each other than the 2 Africans are. And that's simply because there's more genetic variability in Africa than the rest of the planet. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't have geographically based adaptation. But again, it's the things that are relatively easy to understand, such as adaptation to malaria, which occurs not only in Africa, but also in Southern Europe, Spain, the Middle East, and India. Adaptation to altitude, which occurs in the Himalayas, also occurs in the East African Plateau, also occurs in the Andes Plateau. Again, that's not racial. Take another, adaptation to lactase persistence, okay? Occurs in East Africans, occurs in the Middle East, occurs in Northern Europe. So most of this adaptation, by the way, is simple Mendelian traits. The only strong examples we have of polygenic adaptation, and the reason I say this is because behavior, personality, intelligence, those are polygenic, is height in Northern Europe and short height stature in tropical rainforests, which occurs also in Amazon as well as in Central Africa. So once again, not racial. Now, to give you an idea of how recently some of the traits appeared in the human population, here is a site, 7,000-year-old human skeleton found at Logroño Antiterra in Spain. And this is northern Spain. And so ancient DNA sequencing techniques allow us to sequence the genes of this individual. And what they found is the individual had mutations that are consistent with being of European, I won't say ancestry, European occupancy at the time, but most interestingly in the genes that had to do with skin color, SLC45A2, SLC45A5, they actually found the variants that are associated with dark skin. So that means that 7,000 years ago, these Europeans still had dark skin, which makes perfect sense because selection for lighter skin was not strong. It took place over tens of thousands of years. And so the fact that Europeans today are light-skinned is something that's in fact really recent, something that occurred within the last 7,000 years. Another example, blonde hair. Blonde hair in Europeans is a relatively recent trait, about 6,000 years old. It's driven by a particular mutation, but blonde hair in Melanesians who live in the middle of the Pacific and who had dark skin is actually an older mutation that occurs on chromosome 9. Dark skin, blonde hair, light skin, blonde hair. So blonde hair and light skin are not necessarily related to each other. Now, finally, in countries like the United States, where there has been a legacy of chattel slavery, people who are socially defined as Black or African American have significant amounts of European ancestry. That's also undoubtedly true for Canada as well. In African Americans, 16% of their ancestry on average is European. but that depends upon the part of the country. So, for example, in West Virginia, it's 30% or more European ancestry. Similarly, in Washington State. Now, for people who are Latino in the United States, their European ancestry differs between 65 to 85% European, with different amounts of American Indian and African ancestry. And so if I go to the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, people are on average 72% European ancestry, but 16% Amerindian and 12% African. But contrast that to the largest Latino group in the United States, Mexican Americans, who are actually 51% on average Amerindian and only 46% on average European. Now, if you contrast that to Peru, where individuals are 80% Amerindian, or going to the country of Colombia, where within Colombia you get very different admixture percentages depending upon which place you're in, such as in this slide. In the capital city of Medellin, you have an admixture percentage that is similar to that of the nation as a whole. But in the neighboring state of Choco, which was a site of plantation agriculture, you have predominantly African ancestry because these people were enslaved people who did all the agricultural work there. Now, and this again leads me to my concluding comments. So I have worked for some time trying to figure out, what American Christians think about race. And quite frankly, to say the most obvious, American Christians are extremely backward. In fact, a number of sociological studies have shown that the most racist people in the United States are Christians. So let me give you an example of that. So this was a survey question that we did on over 3,000 adults across the United States. And the statement is everyone's ancestors originally came from Africa. So whites, Hispanics, and Blacks disagreed or strongly disagreed with this statement as 67.3%, 60.9%, and 53.8%. So that means that most Americans don't agree with the modern science that everybody originated in Africa. But when we look at it by religious orientation, with NR meaning not religious, WR meaning weakly religious, R religious, and SR strongly religious, we see that this differs by socially defined race, but the strongly religious Blacks and strongly religious whites actually have the highest rejection of the idea that everyone's ancestors really came from Africa. Now, I argue that that comes from being biblical literalists, and therefore, even though the Bible doesn't actually say where the Garden of Eden was, they assume that it wasn't in Africa. Okay, and this is all explained in my piece, Out of Africa, Where Faith, Race, and Science Collide, which is coming out later this year. So, as I have spoken to my sister and brother Christians about these issues of race and racism, I am often asked, am I too worldly? And in that regard, I remind them of the statements of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, and I have watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes a strange, unbiblical distinction between the body and the soul, the sacred and the secular. And this was written in his letter from Birmingham jail, where, of course, as you all know, he was in jail for attempting to desegregate public facilities in Birmingham in 1963.